Hey guys, it's Miss Moore White back with another video. So we're on chapter 13, Worlds Entangled between 1600 and 1750. I'm just going to jump right in. Let me go on and share my screen so we can get into it. Kaboom. All right. So, oh, there's my face. Nice. All right. Okay. All right. So our storylines, our objectives right now, the transatlantic transoceanic trade networks on an unprecedented scale created vast wealth and a new kind of inequalities. And we'll see what that's going to look like as this chapter kind of unfolds. So silver, something that has been elusive to Europeans, is finally going to be in their hands. Silver gave Europeans a commodity to exchange with Asians and began to tilt the balance of wealth and power from Asia toward Europe. New World sugar also accelerated the shift of power in the Atlantic world from the Spanish and the Portuguese to the British and the French. Next up, European merchants and African leaders radically increased the volume and violence of the slave trade, destabilizing Africa. And we're going to see gender imbalances, which is going to lead to even more inequalities and more inequities are going to pop up throughout Africa as well as in Europe as well. Asian rulers in India, China, and Japan and Russian czars enlarged their empires. So we're going to see some growth happening in India, China, Japan, Russia. Okay. And finally, the gunpowder empires, also known as the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal dynasties, all struggled to resist European assaults. Let's get into it. Our objectives. We're going to identify and explain the major steps in the integration of global trade networks in the 17th and 18th century. So we're looking at the 16 and 1700s, and we're also going to analyze examples of resistance to this integration. So we're going to see a lot of change happening, but everybody's not going to be happy about the change that is happening. Next up, we're going to be analyzing the consequences of the Atlantic slave trade for African societies specifically, and how that's going to impact them. We're going to explain the effects of New World silver and increased trade on the Asian empires and their response to it. Ooh, it's going to happen. We're going to compare the impact of trade and religion on state power in various regimes. So how are trade and religion going to impact the different states that are going to rise up and continue to be in power between 1600 and 1750? And finally, we're going to explain the significance of European consumption of goods like tobacco, textiles, and sugar for the global economy. All right, so things that we're looking at, the South Sea bubble, we're going to see that silver is going to enable Europeans to exchange with Asians. And we'll see what's going to happen on a larger scale. So as we have more colonization, as we have more European nations leaving their borders and going into other parts around the world and taking over those parts, they're going to start to enrich themselves on the natural resources that they're going to find in those areas. So from 1600, new commodities such as tobacco and sugar from Brazil and the Caribbean, spices from Southeast Asia, and cotton textiles from India and silk from China tilted the balance of wealth and power to Europe, because they're going to be controlling a lot of these areas with a very unbalanced trade where they're going to be, by there, I mean, Europe is going to be benefiting, while a lot of these other places, Asia, Africa, and the Americas are going to be suffering essentially. We're going to see imperial expansion. So empires are going to expand, and transoceanic trade is going to bring the world together as never before. So when we think about the world coming together, the world being entangled, that means there's going to be more connecting points happening in the world. And we know that before this time period, we know that, America's kind of been by itself. Sub-Saharan Africa has kind of been isolated in certain ways. So we're going to see true integration of all of the different regions in the world happening during this time period, with the exception of like Antarctica or something like that. All right, economic and political effects of global commerce. So closer economic integration destabilized some states while strengthening others. And so then we have to think about, so if one place is gaining, somebody has to be losing. So who is going to be losing and who's going to be gaining? I can think in terms of economics, China is going to be losing when it comes to the economy. When it comes to culture, there's so many places that are going to be losing just because of their unequal trade fading happening with European society. So we're going to see a lot of native culture lost because of death or just kind of erasing happening in the Americas and Southeast Asia, as well as in Africa as well. So extracting wealth. So this term of mercantilism. So mercantilism is going to explain a little bit more on the next slide, what that really looks like during European society, but it's going to be kind of a concept that is prevalent, at least in thought, for a lot of the next few hundred years of interaction with European societies. So mercantilism is going to inspire Spanish and Portuguese success in American exports, and other European powers also launch colonizing ventures in the New World. So once again, Spain, we have, Christopher Columbus is going out there. We have the Portuguese, some of the first people who are going to enslave. They're going to be, kind of showing Europe what it can look like if you just leave your borders. So that's going to lead to a lot of European nations like, Great Britain, France, Germany. They're going to leave their borders and they're going to say, hey, what's out here? Well, let me see what I can explore. But unfortunately, they're not really going to find too many precious metals because what small precious metals that actually are in the New World have already been snatched up by the Spanish and Portuguese settlers. But we are going to see cultivation now of sugarcane, of cotton, of tobacco, of indigo, of rice, of all of those kind of cash crops that are going to be really, really needed in Europe. So we're going to see the New World is going to be used kind of as a breeding ground for all European goods, all the things that they're going to want and need. They're going to grow those in the New World and then transport them over into Europe. So let's see what sugar is going to do. Man, sugar is, it's super addictive, but we can see almost immediately how sugar is going to impact society, culture, economy, everything. So sugar is going to transform the European diet. Europeans imported 12 million tons of sugar between 1619 and 1719. So basically, 1 ton is about 2,000 pounds. So they're going to import 1 ton for every African slave that is going to be taken from West Africa and into the Americas, both North and South America and the Caribbean as well. That's how much sugar they have. From going from like having, basically utilizing honey as a big part of their diet to sweeten things, to ingesting 5 and 6 and increase on of pounds of sugar. I think something like Americans, we intake about 23 to 33 pounds of sugar per year, which is a lot of sugar. And some of you guys might eat more sugar than that. Anyway, let's move on. So let's think about what the actual term mercantilism, what that means. So that economic theory of mercantilism is going to drive empire building. So mercantilism has this belief that wealth is like fixed. Like, so if I have a pie, right, I'm going to cut my pie into slices. If I'm a European nation, you know what I want? I want to get as many slices as possible because in their mind, there's no other pie. Wealth is fixed. There is no additional wealth that's going to be created. So we have to get as much wealth as possible. And so that belief that I have to get everything, I have to get it all, that's really going to shape policy and interaction that's going to happen in the world for, even now, just from like 1600 on down, let's just say that. And so we're going to see that mercantilism presumes the world's wealth was fixed and that one country's wealth came at another's expense. It also assumed that colonies existed to generate wealth for their motherland. So basically, if I have a colony outside of my borders, the only thing that my colony is for is to produce wealth for the homeland. And if it's not producing wealth, it's not productive. And that thought process where this colony has to produce things for the homeland. And if it's not producing, it's a problem. That's going to be a problem later on when we think about the American Revolution and things like that. So let's go on and move on down. So with that means that colonies can't trade with the motherland's enemies or competitors. Let's say that, you have cotton for sale and you're in the New World and you want to sell your cotton for like $5 a pound or whatever. But Great Britain is like, yo, or whatever country you're partnering with, let's just say it's Great Britain. So Great Britain is saying, yo, you can only sell your cotton to us for $3 a pound. But you're like, yo, France over there said that they'll give me $5 a pound. So unfortunately, those colonies were not able to trade officially with these other nations, but on the backhand, they would definitely be getting their money on the side. All right, so we have this guy named Thomas Hobbes. He's going to be pretty important for economic philosophy. He's going to believe that wealth is power and power is wealth. And so that's going to be also a guiding principle for a lot of interactions that we're going to see. And so mercantilism requires an alliance between states and merchants. So those merchants are going to raise up a level in society in different classes. All right. So we're also going to see the government is going to partner up with businesses and give those businesses a lot of power and authority that you wouldn't necessarily give to just a regular business. So now we're going to pop up. We have the English Virginia Company. That's going to be a company located in North America. It's going to be started by merchants, but given power to control commerce and things like that by Great Britain. Or the Dutch East India Company is going to be located in India, and it's going to be created by the Dutch, and they're going to basically have a company that is going to be given power by the government. And that's going to also lead to some very sticky situations later on in world history. All right, this chapter is full of maps. So this is a trade in silver and other commodities map for about 100 years between 1650 and 1750. And we can check this key out right here, and it shows you the different colors of the different places. So we have the Spanish territory, Portuguese, English, French, Dutch, Anglo's areas as well. And then we also see where silver is flowing. So we see silver is leaving over here in the Americas, and it's flowing into Europe. It's flowing around down into Asia as well. So we see that is happening. So a lot of that silver is flowing in these areas, which finally allows Europeans into the Chinese trading markets that had been completely dominated by silver trade, which Europeans had no access to. We also see trade routes happening. So we have silver coming in one way and trade happening in the other. All right, exchanges and expansions in North America. So expanding mainland colonies. Dutch relied on commerce. British and French exploited natural resources in colonies. So once again, Dutch are going to rely on trading and that commerce that's going to bring. But British and French in the New World, so they're going to say, hey, how can we exploit natural resources? How can we grow crops? How can we use the soil? How can we exploit the animals that are there and get their fur and things like that? That's going to be a hallmark of British and French colonization. So the British are going to approach to access to resources was to dispose Amerindians of their land. So we're going to see the British are going to say, yo, we don't really need the Amerindians. We're going to try to push them off of their land. And that's going to be one approach. The French are going to have a completely different approach. So once again, the British are going to push away the Native Americans. That's that kind of American strategy of wanting to get all of the land and push all the Native Americans off. So we're going to see the British are going to establish farms that are going to destroy the environment, and they're not really going to rely on advice from Native Americans. They're going to grow a lot of crops, including tobacco, rice, indigo, all these things along the Atlantic seaboard. So all along that East Coast. So now as we, have kind of developed, we know that those areas are not necessarily always the best to grow crops because it gets pretty cold there, it snows there, things like that. So yeah, long term, it's not going to be the most successful, but it gets them started. All right, next up, we're eventually the dispossessed, Amerindians of their land in the Atlantic Ocean and the Appalachian Mountains. So we're going to see that the Native Americans are going to start moving west, or being forced to move out west, and that's going to continue and continue and continue into the 1800s with a Trail of Tears that Andrew Jackson is going to lead. All right, anyway, so that is the British. The British are going to push away the Native Americans. Not the approach the Dutch and the French chose. So the Dutch and the French are going to rely and depend more on natives. They're going to be like, yo, man, you've been here for like thousands of years, dude. Maybe you know what you're talking about. Maybe. Okay, so they're gonna basically really rely on the natives. They're gonna marry in with the French, with the natives, excuse me. They're gonna do a lot of intermixing in ways that the British would never think to do. Anyway, so they're gonna also rely on the fur trade, which is definitely heavily influenced by Native Americans. And so let's see. All right, yeah, it talks about all that stuff coming up. All right, so the English are going to take over Holland's territory in North America, and they're going to name that colony from New Netherlands into New York, which is the New York that we know in 1664, and that's going to be one of the first strongholds that we see popping up for commerce, at least, happening in the New World. All right, we got another map right here of some of the colonies in the first 150 years of the supposed interaction with Europeans in America. So we see some of the first states popping up and how territories are changing, how we have Spain having territory here, Louisiana having territory here, this kind of this contested area between the British and the French happening here. And then we have these very American places, these 13 colonies that are popping up as well as some of the connection that's happening in Canada, or what we now know as Canada as well. And we can see how France and England are going to combine to share Canada for a little bit. And then over time, by 1763, we see that, France is pretty much gone after the French Revolution is going to happen. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But around the time the French Revolution is kind of happening, they're going to end up losing a fair amount of territory and things like that. And they're going to sell territory and things like that. So we'll see all of this happening, and this territory and this land is going to eventually all become what we now know of as America, but it was English territory. But we see the expansion happening, and also how we're losing some of that Spanish territory that was once Florida, and so on and so forth. All right, so exchanges and expansions in North America. So expanding mainland colonies. So French claims encompass vast territories, including Eastern Canada, the Great Lakes, and the Mississippi Valley. So we're going to see that, the French are going to have this huge piece of land in North America. It's pretty much all connected. It goes all the way down from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up into Canada. So that's going to give them a pretty strategic stronghold. And it's also a really good place in terms of being able to capture fur, being able to grow crops, being able to just have a lot of access. So it's pretty smart. Okay. So we're going to see during that time period that the beaver trade is going to be crucial between Europeans and Amerindians, and how that's basically it's going to lead to a lot of issues too. They're going to over farm or over kill or over hunt, those beaver, which is going to lead to some endangering of the beaver species. The French are going to depend on Indian knowledge in regard to the fur trade, because obviously they're not from there, but the Indians are. And so we're going to see that the French are going to start to rely on some of those Native American ways. And so that mixing that I was talking about, those mesties are going to come up. And we're going to see like some kind of term about mixing race is going to pop up a lot. So mesties, mulattoes, mestizo, and things like that. Those are all going to be terms of kind of mixing of Native blood or mixing of African blood with European blood, and so on and so forth. And so we'll see how the French are going to utilize Amerindians, and they're going to be incredibly helpful, whereas the British are going to push away a lot of the Amerindian help. All right, but one negative though that we're going to see. So basically how the Amerindians are going to receive their funds is going to be weapons and alcohol. So as they try to get more weapons, they're also losing land at the same time. So once again, they're getting weapons from their fur trading, but they're also losing land because the Europeans are encroaching on more and more of their territory, which is going to lead to more conflict between Native American groups. But they have more weapons, which means that the conflict is now more deadly than it was before. So that's going to lead to some issues. We're going to have, once again, endangering of some of the animal populations because they're over hunting them to get more weapons to be able to fight, to secure more land, and so on and so forth. They also have an issue with alcohol because Native Americans unfortunately have a high addiction rate to alcohol. And this is even in the modern day sense. A lot of Native Americans unfortunately have addictions to alcohol. And it is something genetically that I don't remember all the connections, but there is some kind of connection where they have a really intense connection with alcohol. All right. Anyway, so basically moving on though. So as we move on past the mid 1600s on down, British and French are going to focus mostly on sugar plantations, which are incredibly harsh and vicious and brutal. And we'll talk more about those in The Plantation Complex in the Caribbean. So I'm probably going to knock out like 3 or 4 more slides, and then that'll be our break for right there. So in the Caribbean, they're going to rely on slave labor to produce sugar for export, and it's going to be incredibly dangerous. It's known as a killing crop. It's super vicious. A lot of the slaves only are going to live for about 3 years, and they're mostly male because of how horrible it is. Basically super hot, super humid. Slaves are going to work 6 days a week from sun up to sundown, sometimes longer than that. They're going to have inadequate food, horrible living situations, and really bad sanitation. So the slaves are really going to be treated, the enslaved people is probably the proper term, because slave is basically the taking the power, or taking the what am I looking for? It's taking the blame away from the proper person. And so enslaved person lets you know that it wasn't really their fault and somebody had to have been enslaving them, which puts more of the negative onto the slave owners, or in most cases Europeans, but in some cases people could be Native American or African American, or different races and things like that. But anyway, so the enslaved people are treated as non-humans. Unfortunately, they were seen as less than, and we'll see learning more about phrenology and Charles Darwin and his belief in ranking people in different hierarchies and things like that. But anyway, so basically they work 6 or 7 days a week, 16 hours a day, if not longer. And some people are just going to drop dead just of exhaustion in the field, and they're going to basically have to keep working around those dead bodies, which is not sanitary and also mentally just crazy. Anyway, but we are going to see that all enslaved people are not going to just give in to their treatment. They're going to resist by, sometimes having armed flight. We'll see one of the most successful slave rebellions or enslaved people rebellions is going to happen in Haiti between, I think, 1799 and like 1801-ish, something like that. But we're going to see that, armed resistance is going to happen, but most times people are going to just flee. They're going to run away from these situations, and we'll see that some people have more success than in other places. Specifically, when we talk about Brazil, they're going to have a lot of success running away from the European enslavers. All right. And also we're going to see others are going to resist by just slowing down, dragging their feet, stealing, or also just sabotaging the crops or whatever it is. There's nothing for them to do, thankfully. All right, so no single colonial power dominated the Caribbean. So we're going to see that the different islands in the Caribbean, you guys can see on some of the mini maps that are there, that each island kind of is dominated by another European nation. So we have in England, Jamaica, Dutch, the Antilles, French, Saint Domingue, also known as modern day Haiti. On the other side of Haiti is Dominican Republic, which is controlled by Spain. So the French Saint Domingue, produced nearly half of the world's sugar supply and coffee by 1789. It's coming to a halt really soon, as soon as we have the Haitian Revolution, which is an enslaved person's uprising. It's going to happen, as I said previously, in the late 1799-ish. Okay, anyway, the Atlantic system benefited from elite Europeans who amassed new fortunes with colonial natural resources and African slave labor. So once again, this Atlantic system, so going across the Atlantic Ocean, leaving Europe, going into Africa, leaving Africa with slave, going into the North America, and then from North America, taking the exports and bringing those back into Europe and taking that money, putting it back into Africa, and just kind of going in that circle. So that triangle trade is going to truly, truly, truly enrich the European nations, and really, unfortunately, move a lot of enslaved people's labor from Africa into Europe. So once again, slavery had always been around throughout our world's history, but this European version of slavery is going to be the most brutal and the most vicious and the most vile form of slavery that we have ever seen in our world's history. All right, so the human export, so the slave trade in Africa. So what's this going to look like in Africa? So we hear about, we see the results of the slave trade in Africa, hint, hint, all these African Americans who live in America. But what happened in Africa? Like, what was the impact that was happening there? So human exports from Africa soared between the 17th and 18th century. So 16 and 1700s, we're going to see a huge increase in the number of humans leaving, forcefully leaving Africa. So they're going to be essential to the prosperity of Europeans' American colonies. So if we didn't have this human labor moving from Africa into North America, Europe would not be as powerful or as rich as it is today. But with that, it's going to lead to depopulation, destabilization of many parts of Africa. So capturing and shipping slaves. So African elites controlled the capturing of slaves. Yes, that is true. So we're going to see Africans are going to enslave other Africans. And similar to what was happening in North America, where the Native Americans were getting access to weapons, similar things are going to be happening in Africa. So the more slaves you're able to capture, the more weapons you're able to get, which leads to more infighting, which leads to more violence, which leads to more capture of slaves, which leads to more money, which leads to more guns. And all of these things keep going, unfortunately, in a cycle that's very destructive for both America as well as in Africa. So we're going to see about 12.5 million Africans are going to survive forcible enslavement and shipment across Atlantic ports. So 12.5 million are going to survive. Many, many more are going to die along the way. So the high death rates for slaves in Africa, as well as on the transatlantic, there were high death rates because they're literally, if you've ever seen a picture of a slave ship, they are cramped in, they can't move, it's not sanitary, and you're stuck that way for weeks or even months at a time, which led to a high death population, high death toll. So once again, slaves are going to wait for weeks before they get on the vessel. Then they're going to wait for weeks on the vessels, very cramped. And so once again, so lots of issues. All right, so our Caribbean colonies. So what's happening, what's moving? So you can see the Spanish are going to control in this area a lot of North and South America, but the Caribbean, as I said previously, is going to be controlled by most of the European nations and the different crops that are going to be grown or exported or imported and things like that. So we have lots of sugar, rum, coffee, tobacco, silver, gold, grain, fish, rice, timber, shipping services, dye stuff, cacao, all those things are going to be moving around these areas and going to be grown in these areas as well. But specifically sugar, coffee, and tobacco are going to be the most important things that are going to move around in this area. And that's going to be made possible by the slave trade. And here is a map of the slave trade. So believe it or not, the majority of enslaved people, once they left West Africa, they're going to actually end up in South America. Most are going to end up in Brazil. So Brazil to this day has the largest population of Africans outside of Africa. I think in the US, there's like 77 million African Americans. Well, they have over 100 million African or Afro-Brazilian people, excuse me, that are coming directly or direct descendants from West Africa. And then we can see the other majority of slaves that are going to, or enslaved people that are going to leave West Africa are going to trickle through the Caribbean, go into other parts of South America, and a very, very, very small number, only about 370,000 are actually going to end up in North America. We actually see, I believe that I think Mexico actually ends up getting more slaves. A lot of other places ended up getting more slaves than North America did, which is quite incredible. So most of the African Americans that you see in our country are going to descend from these 370,000 that are going to be exported into the US. And then we see a smaller population end up in Europe. Europe is going to end their slave trade 30 to 40 years before a lot of places in North and South America do. And then we also see an even smaller number are going to leave from East Africa and go up into the Middle East, as well as into certain parts or smaller parts of Asia. All right, gender imbalance and slavery. So I think this is going to be the last one that I do for this particular video, and there'll be plenty more videos. I think we're on slide number 17, and I think we have like 40 or something to go. Actually, might as well make it to slide 20. We're so close. So gender imbalance. So we're going to see that males are going to be the preferred, person to be enslaved. That's going to lead to incredible gender imbalance in both Africa and in the Americas. So because slavery is so vicious, because they're killing off slaves or enslaved people pretty regularly, and the lifespan for an enslaved person who's dealing with sugar specifically is only going to be about 3 years. There's going to be this constant need for bodies that's going to happen, and most of those are going to be male bodies. Since there are very few women there, there's going to be very little reproduction and very high death rates. It's not very sustainable. So we're going to see that the males are going to outnumber the female slaves in the New World, whereas in the slave supplying regions in Africa, you're going to have a lot more women. So if you have more men in the New World, that means you're going to have a lot more women in Africa and a lot less men in Africa and a lot less women in the New World. Those things kind of go together. So we're going to see that the women in Africa, the roles are going to shift. They're going to be prioritized or prized for their grain making, their leathers, their cotton, things that are typically seen as more masculine because there are no men to do these things because they're all in. America. All right, so slave trade is going to reinforce traditional practices of polygamy. So polygamy was needed during war times because a lot of your men would die during war times. So you would need one man to repopulate a lot of people. And the same thing is going to happen basically during slavery times as well, is because there are no men there. So the men that do stay around are going to be polygamous and be forced to kind of repopulate Africa because there are no other men. Anyway. All right, the slave trade impact on Africa. So the slave supplying regions, what's going to happen to them? Local leaders are going to actively supply these slaves, these enslaved people to these European buyers. So these Africans are going to enslave other Africans and sell them. Not we want to think about during history, but a pretty accurate description of what actually happened. So we're going to see, even in Africa, we're going to see shiftings of waves of economy and things like that. So trade is going to shift wealth and power from herd or landowning families to supplying or slave or the merchant and warrior class. So before in Africa, if you were able to produce things, if you were able to herd your animals and things like that, you had power. But now the power is going to come to the people who are able to enslave, and those who are able to sell things to Europeans are going to make a lot more money. And as I said previously, the slave trade is going to prompt civil war. So violence is going to happen with regions in Africa because they're one jockeying for who's going to enslave more people, but then also we see there's a fight to see if people are going to stop enslaving people as well. So once again, slave trade helps some merchants and warlords consolidate and extend political power with wealth and arms. So as they sell people, they're able to get wealth and arms and able to create more havoc and violence with the arms that they're able, or the weapons they're able to procure. The Asante state is going to be one example. They're going to be wealthy because of their gold, which allows them to acquire firearms and slaves, which helps them develop their military and their economic power, which they're going to be known for going into the future in West Africa. All right, the slave trade's impact on Africa, all right, continued. Although the slave trade enriched and empowered some African nations, it really cost Africa dearly. So one, we see the power is gonna shift in Africa from rural places into the urban ports. Is that what we really need when most of the populations live in rural areas during this time period? Probably not, but it's gonna be an unfortunate thing that happens. The demography is going to go through a huge shift. The population, we're going to lose, even if we, okay, so 12.5 million people are going to be gone and most of them are going to be men. That's huge. If today we lost 12.5 million people in the US, that will be a huge hit and a huge loss. And we're talking about when a time when the population is much smaller than it is today. I don't even think there's probably even a billion people, or maybe if there is a billion people, it's not even 2 billion. So this 12.5 million is a huge hit in Africa. Okay. The trade is going to enhance the warrior class. Once again, an imbalance of power. So the warriors, those with weapons, are going to be able to succeed. But remember that a lot of times in Africa, the warrior elites, those who they're able to basically secure themselves with and even protect themselves from Europeans with their basic weapons, their bows, their arrows, their things like that, but their spears. But man, these guns are going to change everything. All right, so we're going to see dislocations. People are going to have to move or flee or all those things. Internal power struggles and economic hardships are going to precipitate the rise and the fall of West African kingdoms. And it's not all going to be pretty. All right, so let's stop there before I go into Asia. I think that's good. That's 19 slides. We're on our way in. Hopefully I can do this in 2 or 3 videos and not 2. So anyway, have a great one, guys. I'll see you guys in class. Bye.